Sausage.
Hello everyone, this is Attack the Backlog, the podcast where I, Mark Kuznez, tries to make a dent in their backlog one game at a time. This episode is all about Dead Space 3, the follow-up to Dead Space 2, and that's all I've got. Dead Space 3 originally came out on February 5th, 2013 for PC, PS3, and Xbox 360. Dead Space is a franchise I have no particular affinity for. I loved the first game, but I thought the second was just okay. Because of that, I had very little interest in Dead Space 3 when it originally came out, and that's why I never played it. Until now. And with the announcement of a Dead Space remake, I figured, it was probably the perfect time to finally play Dead Space 3. A lot has been said about Dead Space 3 since its original release, most of it negative. However, when you go back and look at the reviews, you'll see a wide range of opinions from those who thought it was amazing. A handful of reviews almost gave it a perfect score to those who thought it was disappointing on all fronts. I can't say I was disappointed since I went in with no expectations, but I do think it's an aggressively average and forgettable game. Dead Space 3 continues the story of Dead Space, but who cares about Dead Space's story anyway? I sure don't, and Dead Space 3 did nothing to change that. I don't suddenly care about Isaac Clarke or those around him, and I don't care about what's happening to them in their future version of our world. The only joy I found came from when characters would do questionable things. Your ex plays a prominent role in the game, and her massive asshole of a boyfriend is eventually shot in the head by you for being all assholey, and while she's upset at first, it doesn't take her long to toss Mr. Asshole aside in favor of kissy time with Isaac. I love you so much, Isaac. Go give me a kissy. What kind of kissing sounds are these? I don't know, but it's okay. The characters in Dead Space 3 are all stupid to varying degrees, just as stupid as that kissy noisy I was making, I don't know, with little depth and little reason to care for their well-being. But that's fine because I never cared about them to begin with. My love for the first game came from how well it played, how good it was at creating an eerie atmosphere, and all the tense scenarios it threw me in that kept me on the edge of my seat, not because of the story or the characters. I may not have cared about the story, big or small, but the moment-to-moment action was incredibly engrossing. Dead Space 3 gets some of this right, but not all of it. The sound design deserves all of the praise, literally. All of it. The visuals are good too, but it's the sound that makes certain situations unsettling and certain enemies scary. Scary because they make such disgusting sounds that I physically became uncomfortable whenever I heard them around. The exploders, for instance, scream and gurgle in such a way that everything felt gross until they were dead and quiet. Now, a lot of this audio may be ripped directly from the first two games, but it's still as effective as it ever was and is the one aspect of Dead Space 3 that stuck with me both during my playthrough and after it was over. Everything else was varying degrees of average, forgettable, and dull. The enemies you fight are boring. Sure, plenty are returning from the previous games, but the way they come at you, often in waves and waves until they're all dried up, leaves little room for creative encounters or scary situations. Too often will you enter a space where instead of wondering if an enemy will show up or where they might show up from, you're wondering how many waves of enemies you'll have to deal with until the music changes and you can't get back to progressing the story. What was that? Music! And I really blew a chance to put in a little Dead Space joke there when I was saying you often enter a space? A dead space? I could have done that. It would have been great, but I didn't. Even worse, the boss fights, what few exist, are even more boring because you mostly fight the same stupid spider that shows up, fights you for a bit, and then runs away to fight you another day. You fight this creature 3 times and the fights never become more interesting, only the same shit in a different environment. The other boss fights are okay, but forgettable fights against incredibly large monsters who pose little threat and simply require one to hit their weak point until they're good and dead. They don't attack in clever ways and instead litter the playfield with regular enemies who are just there to get in your way as you're trying to defeat the actual threat. On top of the boring gunplay, which feels good for the record. It's just the scenarios you're thrown in that are boring. The humdrum world makes exploration worthless, and the game drags on way too long. It took me around 12 hours to finish Dead Space 3, and boy, did I feel every one of those hours. It feels like an 8-hour game stretched into 12, and it feels this way all the time. It's not like it starts to drag at hour 6 or hour 8, but drags the whole time. It's the gaming equivalent of "Are we there yet?" where yet comes way later than expected. All that said, Dead Space 3 isn't a bad game, but it also isn't a good one. Unless you're a die-hard Dead Space fan, there's no reason to bother with Dead Space 3. Just play Die Hard instead, you die-hard fan of Dead Space. You can play the entire game cooperatively, which may make it a lot better, but I played it solo, and when playing it solo, you barely even know the character your cooperative friend would be controlling exists. So I'm actually kind of interested in seeing how co-op changes things up, but not interested enough to go through the game a second time. If you're like me and never got around to Dead Space 3, you're better off keeping it that way and replaying the first or second game instead. Anywho, that will do it for this here episode of Attack the Backlog. Once again, I am Marcus Nez. Y'all can find me on Twitter and pretty much everywhere at PX Sausage. If you'd like to see me streaming games like Dead Space 3, you can do so over at twitch.tv/PX Sausage. And if you'd like to watch videos I make, like the one for this here episode of Attack the Backlog, you can do that over at youtube.com/Pixelated Sausage. Speaking of Pixelated Sausage, if you just put a little dot, just a little one, doesn't need to be big, just a little one, and then you put COM after that, so that's .com, you get my site, pixelatedsausage.com, where you can find this podcast and the Pixelated Sausage podcast, both of which are available on podcast services across the globe. You can also check out my art on the site, and if you see something you like, you can purchase a print of the piece you fancy. And if you fancy the site in general and anything that we do, please go over to patreon.com/PXS and support us that way. As always, thank you for watching or listening. I hope you enjoy this here episode, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.